She soiled herself on the wedding bed, not during labor, not in sickness, but in the first fragile hours of her role as queen. The air stank of roses, sweat, and shame. He turned from her, silent and pale, as candles flickered over blood-red curtains. Outside, courtiers whispered already, their laughter muffled by thick stone walls. The king, young, revered, mercurial, sat frozen at the edge of the bed, staring down at his bride with eyes drained of affection. What had begun with music and vows turned, in a heartbeat, to disgust. But why? Why had this noble daughter of a powerful dynasty collapsed into humiliation under velvet sheets? The ceremony had been perfect, the alliance strategic, the expectations monumental, and yet, in one grotesque moment, centuries of royal pride stained the mattress beside her. What had broken her, and what would it cost the crown? Her name was Isabella of Valois, barely 12 when she was sent across the Channel, gift-wrapped in silk and sorrow. England's boy king, Richard II, was nearly 3 times her age. Mourning a dead wife and a collapsing realm, their union was meant to calm tempests. Instead, it lit new ones. In France, her family wept behind painted smiles. In England, Parliament scoffed at the child bride, but the wedding went forward. Spectacle masked discomfort. The streets of London thundered with celebrations, but behind closed doors, anxiety clung like wet linen. Even the palace walls seemed to breathe unease. Isabella's eyes, too wide for her face, sought guidance from rigid matrons who muttered prayers instead of answers. And Richard, king in name, stranger in soul, had no warmth to give her. She was a child flung into a lion's mouth, crowned with daffodils, and slowly breaking under the weight of royal silence. That wedding night would mark the first fracture in a shattered destiny. Richard, still haunted by the execution of his allies and the treachery of his uncles, could not see his bride without the specter of politics behind her eyes. As Isabella trembled beneath the weight of expectation, his touch never came. Instead, silence stretched like a blade between them. Courtiers waited for signs of consummation, for proof that the marriage had political teeth. But behind bolted doors, there was only stillness, then the sour scent of humiliation. Richard left her lying in ruin, a girl bruised not by violence, but by abandonment. Was it disgust at her youth, or at the monstrous world he now commanded? In the weeks to follow, rumors would rush like wildfire. Was the queen defective? Was the king impotent? In truth, they were both victims, held hostage by crowns too heavy for their fragile frames. But history rarely lets wounds scab. Richard's enemies, seeing his faltering alliance, sharpened their knives. Among them, Henry Bolingbroke, exiled but watching, saw the king's weakness not only in Parliament, but in the bedchamber. Richard had no heir, no stability, no strength of image. And Isabella, child queen in a foreign land, became a symbol of all that was broken. She walked palaces like a ghost, draped in jewels that couldn't mask her growing dread. Always watched, never touched. Her innocence became a spectacle. Whispers thickened into plots. The court turned cold. An unconsummated alliance meant more than embarrassment, it meant vulnerability. Nations bled over lesser cracks. And somewhere beneath the crushing halls of Westminster, Richard began to unravel. His crown weighed heavier each day. Did he see in her the child he once was, abused by power? Or did he simply see failure? Whatever the cause, the storm gathering around them would not wait. The year turned, and with it, the tide. Richard, plagued by delusions of divine rule and visions of betrayal, grew erratic. He banished nobles without trial, revoked inherited lands, and cloaked himself in ceremonies meant to obscure decay. Isabella, barely reaching adolescence, became a doll at his side, decorative, silent, crumbling. When Bolingbroke returned from exile, not as a supplicant but as a storm, there was no defense. Richard rode north to muster loyalty. He found none. His past cruelties left him almost friendless. Isabella waited in the tower, listening for hooves in the night. When word reached her that her husband had surrendered without a blade drawn, her voice broke for the first time since arriving in England. Not out of love, but dread. She knew kings who fall do not fall alone. Yet still she waited, for a crown that never fit, for a man who vanished like mist, for a future already dead. They shaved Richard's head before the axe ever fell, not with blades, but with humiliation. Imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, stripped of his robes, his titles, and the visage of kingship, Richard II became a ghost of sovereignty, while Isabella, still frozen in youth, was kept miles away. Spoon-fed, sanitized lies. She was told he was safe, that he would return. But deep in her bones, she felt the silence scream louder than words. No body was sent. No farewell was granted. Only a cold relic returned a dead marriage without a death certificate. France demanded her back. England clutched her still, as if holding the ghost of an alliance could ward off war. By 15, she was sent home, changed. Her innocence had been devoured by politics, her voice silenced by power. Years later, when she finally married again, she spoke little of her first husband, but behind her eyes sat the memory of that first night, the scent, the shaking, the shame when a crown crushed a child into legend. But the story does not end with Richard's fall or Isabella's return. History, true history, echoes in scars. Years after her second marriage, even after giving birth to children who would chase their own thrones and ghosts, Isabella's smile never reached her eyes. Those who met her in her later years described a woman both regal and remote, with laughter that died quickly and a gaze that seemed forever fixed on something far behind her. One evening, during a royal feast in Angoulême, a servant spilled wine across a white linen table. Isabella froze. For a split second, her hands trembled. She stared not at the mess but through it, as if chasing the scent of roses past their bloom, the sound of silk rasping beneath a crown, the echo of a door closing on a night she never understood. Some said she whispered his name then. Others swore she said nothing at all. What we remember of kings are usually wars, decrees, portraits. But Richard II left behind a relic stranger, darker, the unsettling legacy of a marriage born in manipulation and buried in silence. And Isabella, neither villain nor heroine, walked the dangerous line etched by men with crowns and appetites. Her name faded from power but clung to poetry, half-truths, and monarchical ledgers. After her death at age 28, no great monument rose, no epic was penned. Yet her life-stolen youth, shattered innocence, a scream never heard remains one of history's quiet tragedies. A princess who never had a childhood, a queen who never had a king, a wife whose wedding night became a whispered caution. In the folds of royal tapestries, beneath marble effigies and gilded myths, Isabella's story remains. And in quiet corners of forgotten palaces, if you listen close enough, you can almost hear the rustle of silk, the flutter of a child's breath, and the unbearable silence of history too cruel to speak aloud. Centuries later, Richard's tomb in Westminster Abbey bears an effigy of peace, eyes closed, lips calm, hands folded in eternal prayer. Tourists pass it daily, unaware of the nightmare stitched into its stone. Isabella lies elsewhere, in Orleans, beneath a simpler slab, her face carved with the soft sorrow of forgotten queens. No marble can capture what passed between them, what broke in the shadows or trembled behind veils. But listen, truly listen, and the silence becomes thunder. What began as a royal alliance became a cautionary tale whispered through generations. Power devours. Crowns do not shelter girls, nor do palaces cradle the innocent. They consume, they crush. Isabella's legacy is not enshrined in gold, but in the fragile memory of a child forced to wear a woman's fate. A wedding night that bled into centuries, a bed that became a battlefield, and a silence that history still cannot look away from. Even now, her story flickers at the edge of our collective memory, like a candle guttering in a tomb. Not taught in textbooks, not etched in glory, but alive in the spaces between official histories where women weep silently and children wear crowns far too soon. Isabella of Valois was not a queen of grandeur, but of grief, not of conquest, but caution. Her story is not one of triumph, but of warning. And Richard, a king perhaps born too early or broken too late, whose final legacy was not in policy, but in pain. In the cathedral hush of Westminster, where monarchs sleep under stone, their names endure, but it is the silence between them that tells the real tale. A tale of a bride who bled shame instead of love, of a king who mistook fear for strength, and of a night that began with vows and ended with a graveyard silence that still refuses to die. So why does it matter now? A tale of long-dead monarchs and soiled silks. Because history is not buried, it is mirrored. In every courtroom where children are bartered for alliances, in every institution where silence is stronger than truth, Isabella's ghost lingers. Her wedding bed became a symbol, not of failure, but of the systems that traded girls for peace, that measured nations on the backs of the voiceless. Richard's downfall was not a singular crime, but the final shudder of a kingdom built on illusion. And Isabella, she reminds us that behind every crown is a child, behind every alliance, a cost. Perhaps the flickering torches of marriage halls still echo her name. Perhaps what we mourn is not just a broken queen, but every moment where power chose spectacle over mercy. The past isn't past. It breathes, it scars, and it whispers, still, from the blood-stained sheets of forgotten kingdoms. In the shadowed halls of failed empires, it is often the unseen who suffer longest. Isabella's legacy, though buried in dust and obscured by the Baroque narratives of kings, breathes through every silenced voice, erased from royal history. She was not the first, nor the last, to be sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. But her story lingers because it was never truly told, only hinted at, whispered behind shuttered windows, coded in the tone of court poets, and the spacing of prayers left unanswered. Her humiliation was treated as anecdote, her mourning as protocol. Yet in that single grotesque moment, the wedding bed recoiling from touch, the stink of shame curling beneath royal tapestries, lies something deeper than history alone. It is the truth of power, that it forgets the living in favor of legend, that it asks children to carry the weight of centuries, that it smiles as it breaks them, and even now, it waits to do so again. So when you next walk beneath vaulted ceilings or gaze upon portraits golden with time, remember what those silks covered, what those vows hid. Remember Isabella, not embroidered into banners or carved into coin, but lingering in the shadows cast by history's triumphs. Her suffering was not spectacular, and that is precisely why it matters. It was quiet, hidden, institutional, and all the more haunting for it. The shriek she never gave still echoes in places power calls sacred. The smile she faked haunts every coronation, a ghost in ivory. Because behind every gilded promise, there is a cost. Behind every kingdom raised, a girl buried. And sometimes, it is not in the roaring battles or royal decrees that history speaks loudest, but in the soiled sheets, the closed door, and the silence no crown could ever hide. That silence, once born in a palace bed, survives still, terrible, unforgiving, and louder than 1,000 thrones crashing into dust. That silence stretches even now, not as a solemn relic, but as a warning writ in velvet and bone. For every young queen draped in diamonds, for every prince raised in rooms grown cold with inheritance, Isabella's story endures where the historians hesitated in the breathless pause after the music, in the unspoken names of bridal ceremonies where eyes are too wide for comfort. We watch history backwards, glorifying what we ought to grieve, and still, we forget the girl in the dress too heavy, the king in a world too cruel, the marriage made of whispers. Richard and Isabella vanished beneath the weight of roles they never chose. One broke from within, the other was broken by design. But where they were buried in silence, we now listen. Listen not to honor kings or lament their fates, but to see with clarity every silk-covered wound authority dares not show. And in that vision, perhaps, we begin to rise from the silence they were never allowed to escape. So let the final word not be theirs, not Richard's, nor Parliament's, nor the blind scribes who measured a queen by her fertility and grace by her silence. Let it belong instead to the silence itself, a silence that refuses to be history's footnote, a silence born of royal dread and girlish horror. It speaks not in names or victories, but in broken eyes and unslept nights. Today, we stand not at Isabella's tomb, but in her truth, in the echo of her stolen childhood, in the knowledge that beneath every crown, every throne, every anthem of empire, someone paid in sorrow, that someone once soiled herself not out of weakness, but out of a world too cruel for innocence, and that long after kings are dust and dynasties drowned in time, it is the suffering of the unseen that will remain flickering, haunting, waiting for us to finally see it. Because in the cruel theatre of monarchy, it is not always swords that draw blood. Sometimes it is silks, soaked in shame. Sometimes it is a glance withheld, a night endured, a breath stifled behind brocade and obligation. Isabella's story, a portrait painted with silence, framed in expectation, and hung in the dim corridors of forgotten memory, endures not because she ruled, but because she waited. Waited for love that never came, for a future that never unfolded, for a voice that history rarely permits girls to keep. So when you hear the pages of the past turn, listen for the ones that rustle faintly, painfully, defiantly. The ones not written by kings, but by those they passed by. And when you see a crown gleam beneath museum lights, do not look at its gold, but at what was buried to make it shine. In that reflection, Isabella lingers still, the child, the queen, the silence, and she demands to be remembered. Her name is whispered not in glory, but in grief. Isabella of Valois, queen without a kingdom, bride without a beginning, remains a testimony to the hushed agony history seldom records. No lineage clung tightly to her name, no son wore the crown her womb never bore. Yet still she endures, found in poetry's pauses, in the cold wind sweeping through cathedrals thick with marble echoes, in the tear-streaked whispers of women bound by duty and forgotten by power. Her story is not over because it was never truly told. It slides between chapters, eludes footnotes, evades monuments. But if you close your eyes and listen beyond the armor and fanfare, you'll hear it not a scream, but a breath choked by velvet. A child's cry no kingdom could hush, and in that mourning breath, we all bear witness to what was done, to what was lost, and to what dares, even now, to speak not in volume, but in truth. So let history remember her not by her silence, but by ours, the silence we are finally breaking. Let Isabella be more than a shadow in royal scrolls, more than a casualty folded neatly between alliances and inheritances. Let her be the mirror we dare not look into, the unanswered question at the heart of all crowned tragedies. Her wedding night was not just the ruin of a child, it was the revelation of an empire's indifference. We end not with closure, because there was none, only the ache of what was never made right. But if this tale reaches even one listener who pauses, who thinks, who feels that ancient chill tremble through the gowns and gravestones of time, then perhaps Isabella has finally spoken. Her voice, stolen in life, returns now through us, barely above a whisper, yet far too loud to ignore. Not a lament, a reckoning. And so, beneath the dust of crumbled dynasties and the gleam of curated crowns, Isabella's breathless truth cuts through. This story, raw, relentless, buried, claws its way out, not for spectacle, but remembrance. She was not a monarch etched in triumph, but a girl sewn into politics like thread through bruised skin. Her fate was not accidental, but constructed stitch by silent stitch, expectation by unspoken rule. And though she no longer walks this world, her echo does in every gaze a child casts before the altar of duty, in every silence imposed where a scream should live. This was not simply a wedding night gone wrong. It was a ritual of erasure, a sanctified betrayal packaged in lace. Let us not bow before her portrait, but kneel beside her absence, because in that missing space where joy should have bloomed, where youth should have been cherished, lies the cost of crowns, and Isabella paid it in full. And if you still wonder why Isabella matters, think not of queens or kings, but of every child swallowed by a system that prized order over innocence. Her wedding night is etched not in scandal, but in the marrow of history's most brutal truths, that when power dresses up cruelty in silks and hymns, suffering becomes tradition, that when duty silences fear, entire lives unravel in quiet. Isabella is no mere figure from a forgotten age. She is every voice stifled behind a curtain, every shiver disguised as grace. Her name, once buried beneath layers of diplomatic consequence, rises now not in accusation, but in revelation. For in the tender spaces between the coronation chants and the quiet sobs beneath veils, we see her real, raw, and still waiting to be known. This story ends not with a crown, but with a question. How many more Isabellas lie silent beneath history's jeweled silence, waiting for us to finally speak their names? And in that question lies our burden, not to rewrite the past, but to unearth it, to pull forth every silenced Isabella from beneath the ceremonies and chronicles that buried them. Her veil was not just bridal, it was historical, woven from fear, duty, and forced forgetting. This tale of a child who soiled herself on her wedding night is not grotesque because of what it reveals about her, but because of what it reveals about us, our systems, our silence, our estrangement from empathy. If we are to build a history worth remembering, we must look not merely at those who wore the crown, but at those it crushed. Isabella's story ends, yes, but her voice must not. Let it echo in halls where decisions are made, in classrooms where truths are shaped, and in hearts that still believe justice can grow from acknowledgement. For in the end, remembrance is resistance, and Isabella, broken, brave, and near forgotten, deserves nothing less. So let this be the final breath, not of tragedy, but of reckoning. Let Isabella's name, once reduced to a mere footnote of dynastic convenience, rise now as the lesson we dared too long to overlook. For in her silence, we hear the questions history evades. What is love when power dictates its form? What is consent in a world that robes coercion in silk? Hers was not a fairy tale corrupted, but a ritual disguised as romance. And though centuries stretch between her broken youth and our modern facades, the architecture of suffering remains eerily the same, ornate, revered, and bloodless in appearance. So if this story wounds you, let it. If it lingers, let it. For only by feeling the weight she bore can we even begin to lift it in others. And maybe then, maybe the next Isabella we meet will not be remembered in silence, but in strength. That is the history still waiting to be written. So now, if only for a heartbeat, let us write her name where once it was erased. Let us carry Isabella of Valois, not as a monarch's shadow, but as history's mirror, cracked, defiant, and deeply human. Her pain was not symbolic, it was embodied. Her silence was not poetic, it was imposed. The soiled sheets, the aborted destiny, the life consumed before it could even begin. These are not curiosities for a museum or whispers for scandal. They are truths, agonizing and brilliant, that demand we see not just the pageantry of the past, but the people beneath it. And if after all this, her story still lingers in your chest, raw, heavy, unresolved, then perhaps she has finally been given what she was always denied. Not pity, not myth, but presence. In the long, haunted corridors of our memory, let her walk at last without shame, named, known, and finally, never again, alone. And so, as the echoes of thrones crumble into the dust of oblivion, let this be the ledger not of kings, but of cost. Isabella's story began in silk and ended in silence, but between them lives a truth too powerful to bury. She is the question we must keep asking, the breath we must hold just a moment longer, not for spectacle, not for sorrow, but for solidarity with every unheard voice history dared to forget. Her legacy is not ink on parchment, but the ache that refuses to fade. A child made a queen made a ghost turned into reckoning. When power dresses its cruelty in gold, it is truth that must rise unveiled. Remember her not with bowed heads, but with open eyes. For in remembering Isabella, we do not mourn the past, we rewrite its silence, we choose to see. And in that sight, her story and all the others like it finally breathes. And if you carry nothing else from this story, carry her name. Let it settle in the quiet moments, the ones where silence feels too heavy. Isabella of Valois was not just a girl whose wedding night became legend, soaked in shame. She was the embodiment of every truth polite history forgets. She reminds us that beneath every coronation lies a cost, and under every anthem, a child once wept unheard. Her agony was not extraordinary, that is why it matters. So let the next tale we tell not begin with crowns or treaties, but with her, with the girl who trembled, who waited, who was forgotten until now. Because if memory can be an altar, then let this be her sanctuary. Let her name survive not in whispers, but in resolve. for the cost she bore can only be answered in how fiercely we choose to remember and speak her truth. And so, at the close of this tale stitched together by sorrow, shame, and shadows, we do not turn the page, we hold it. Hold it with reverence for the life that unraveled in its margins. Isabella of Valois, reduced in her lifetime to decoration, deserves in ours to be seen whole, as a child forced to bleed history beneath velvet, as a voice drowned in ceremony, as a truth carved not in stone, but in silence. Her soiled wedding night was never her sin, but her sentence. And as we lay this story to rest, let us not forget what it implores, that beneath every glittering lineage is a girl who bore the weight. This was not just tragedy, it was testament, not an ending, but an indictment. For if history teaches anything, it is this: justice cannot be sculpted from silence, and remembrance, if brave enough, can become the redemption time refused to give her. So let this final breath echo not in mourning but in transformation. Isabella does not speak now from beneath a crown, nor from the pages of royal decree, but from the hush between heartbeats, daring us to remember that empires rise and fall on the backs of the unseen. Her life, stripped of justice, demands that we look harder at every cost hidden beneath grandeur. This is not just her story. It is a reflection in every girl silenced by pageantry, every soul shadowed by sovereignty. Her name, once a casualty of indifference, now becomes a drumbeat in the call for truth. And as the last flicker fades on this tale, let her legacy ignite instead, not in sorrow, but in the fire of recognition. Isabella of Valois, queen in name, child in truth, now lives not in silence, but in the echo of those who choose to remember fully, fiercely, and finally forever.